Crosswinds, welcome back to the Crosswinds Church More Than Sunday podcast. We're glad you're joining us today, and I am doing a follow-up with Michael Mosby, who I spoke with last week. We're going to talk a little bit more about empathy and what that looks like, especially when it comes to what it means to empathize with the people of color in our lives after situations like the one that most recently has happened with George Floyd have happened, when racial injustice is going on around us. All right, everyone, welcome back. I've got Michael Mosby, who's back on with me. You heard his podcast with us last week. Michael, thanks for coming and doing this again.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Glad we can do it.
I am glad we can do it too. When we were recording last week and just kind of discussing together what it's like to be a person of color in our community and at Crosswinds, and then having seen what happened to George Floyd, one of the things we talked about was being an ally. I believe the word you used was allyship. Is that correct?
Yes,
Is that what
that's
we
correct.
talked about? And you gave us some really practical things for what it looks like for us to be allies. And among them, what we really sensed in that was this concept of what it means to come alongside somebody with empathy in moments like this. And I had said, "Ooh, can we do another podcast? Can we do another podcast where we just talk about that? Because I don't know that we fully understand what it looks like, especially in a situation like this one. We know empathy. You know, we did this series earlier this year called "There's No Good Card for This." I don't know if you remember that one.
I remember it. Yeah.
And good. I'm glad you do, because I, as one who teaches quite a few of them, I barely remember a lot of times what I've been talking about. But we did a lot of what it looks like to come alongside someone who's hurting, and often that means sick, or they've lost someone, they're mourning the death of someone in their family. But when it comes to empathy alongside someone who is struggling through an injustice or fear potentially that comes alongside that injustice, I don't know that we really understand what to do. So I was hoping we could talk about it.
Sure. Let's do it.
All right. So maybe the good question to start with is, for you this week, what has been helpful? I mean, where have you noticed people in the last few weeks empathizing with you in a really good way? What can we learn from them?
Well, I think I have a really good story for this. So I attended the Livermore rally and march last Thursday.
Yeah.
And I got to tell you, for me, it was extremely cathartic to be able
Yeah.
to do it, because I was holding a lot of weight
Yeah.
before
Yeah.
that happened. And while we were on the march to the fountain downtown,
Yeah.
had a white gentleman walk up to me as we were marching, and he said, "Hey, I just really want you to know that, I'm open to this. I'm receptive to this. I'm in a mode of listening, and I'm just going to keep my mouth shut."
Mm.
And I said to him, I said, "That's a wonderful first step.
Yeah.
One, thanks for being courageous enough to walk up to me, a stranger who you don't know what my
Right.
reaction could have been. So I want to I
Yeah.
want to give you kudos for that.
Yeah.
And having a listening spirit, an active listening spirit, is a good first step."
Yeah.
I said, "However, I don't want you to lose your voice.
Mm.
But specifically, I don't want you to lose your voice in the environments that matter. So you and I
Mm.
are having this great conversation, and we can talk, and you can listen to my story and my experience. But what I want you to do, because that's where a lot of us are with this, is what do we do now?
Yeah.
Actively do." I said, "But
Yeah.
what I want you to do is, when you're with your white family members, when you're with your white friends, when you're with your white colleagues, when you're in an environment where something like this may come up, that's
Mm-hmm.
where I want you to remember me and remember this conversation, and stand up and use your voice, if it's appropriate to do so."
That's good.
Yeah,
That's good.
yeah,
Great story.
yeah.
Um, Yeah. So I can't help but, as a pastor, as you tell that story, draw like 3 or 4 points out of it.
Go for it.
So let me. So the first thing that this guy did was he acknowledged your pain. He acknowledged what you were going through just by coming up to you and beginning that conversation. He's acknowledging something, right? Huge, huge part of what empathy is in my
Yeah.
mind. It begins with acknowledging that, and I think sometimes in moments like these, they can become very politicized, and
Yeah.
that's unfortunate because
Yeah.
frankly, this is not as political as it sounds. This is a Jesus thing.
Yeah. I think
This
so
is a
too.
we talked last week. This is a biblical thing. This is not a Republican or Democrat thing. This is just a what it means to love your neighbor thing. And as such, it's okay, no matter who you vote for, to acknowledge pain in other people
Yeah.
and say, I see that this thing has happened and it's got to be affecting you. So that's a big part of empathy. The other thing he did is he listened or said he's going to listen in that moment, that he's here to listen. I think that's another really, really important one. Have you had a bunch of people who are listening this week? I know my fear as a white person, and again, I said last week, I don't speak for all white people. You don't speak for all black people, but my fear is that I text. I was listening to an African American pastor friend of mine talking, and he was like, "I got more texts this week from white people." Just saying, hey, I'm praying
Yeah.
for you. I want to
Yeah.
talk. You want to get coffee? Uh, he said, if I had $1 for every one of those, have you had a lot of people reaching out saying, hey, I just want to listen this week?
I've had a ton via
Yeah.
Facebook, text,
Yeah.
email. By the way, appreciate every single one of them too, because
Okay.
each one's an opportunity.
Yeah. Yeah.
At least that's the way I look at it. Each one's an opportunity.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you something interesting that it's also happened this week. Um, one of the 4 officers in Minneapolis is Asian,
Mm.
and so I have a number of Asian friends, and was wondering what the reaction was from their community.
Yeah.
And overwhelmingly, the Asian community, and you can see this especially in Oakland and San Francisco, has allied with the black community and said, we have to own up to some things in
Mm.
our community as well. And the answer, we believe, is to ally. So
Yeah.
the reason I bring that up is because a number of the folks that reached out to me are a number of my Asian friends as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Wow. But this is not bothering you that people are reaching out to acknowledge your pain and listen. You're not going, what the heck, everybody?
for the most part, it doesn't bother me. There are a few from people like I haven't heard from in forever,
Yeah. Yeah.
or I haven't had a lot of interaction with them.
Right. Right.
So this just seems, and as a matter of fact, can we take a sec
Yeah.
just so I can contextualize how I think about empathy?
Yeah. Please.
So, we talked about this last time, how my brain works in threes. And so when I think about this and these people reaching out, to me, it's sympathy.
Okay.
Um,
As
sympathy,
opposed to empathy, is that what you mean?
yeah. To
Yeah.
me, sympathy is a bit more like a soundbite. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and that I'm not being judgmental about that and saying it's less than.
Yeah.
But it tends to be, an in the moment thing. And, I just want to express my wishes to or express this for you, or, I'm praying for you.
Yeah. Yeah.
It, and by the way, it stays, I think, fairly with the person who's offering the soundbite.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think it's easy when you're in that space to justify
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
say, at least it's not this,
Mm-hmm.
or at least it's not this that happened to me.
Yeah. Yeah.
You start to have that justification going on. I think if you stay in the sympathy space, you can get
Yeah.
there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Empathy challenges us to open ourselves up and to join in with the person,
Yeah.
right? So this is following up this soundbite
Mm-hmm.
with, and we talked about this last week, getting
Getting
close to the
close.
person
Yeah.
and hearing their feelings and hearing what they're going through and joining in on that and connecting on a heart level.
Yeah. Yeah.
To me, that's gets into empathy when I think of
Right.
empathy. And then
Right.
the third one, because we keep talking about this action, the third one to me is compassion.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Empathy, I can think, can drive us to compassion, where we do more than join in with the person. We take an active step to
Yeah.
do something to undergird them, to support them, to walk alongside them. It's something after. And the process is opening up ourselves more and more and giving more of ourselves.
So that's great, and this speaks to the point you just made about using your voice. Next time you're sitting at a table at work with your white colleagues, or you're at a family dinner with white people, for you to speak up. That's part of what it is to show empathy as well, and that might be a little different than empathy that I show for somebody who has lost a loved one, or
Yeah.
empathy for the person who is going through cancer treatment right now, or I have action for those people as well.
Yeah.
But this is a different kind of action, right?
It's a
This
different
is
kind.
this is a very different kind of action that involves saying, to be a supporter of yours, an ally with you. I'm
Yeah.
actually going to try to keep this stuff from happening in the future, and part of the way I do that is calling it out when I see it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah,
I call it compassion remains.
yeah, yeah. There
Right.
you go.
A
Yeah,
week later, 2 weeks later, 6 weeks later, 3 months
right.
later, compassion should remain. And as a black person, that's what we're hoping.
Yeah.
That this what people may be joining into in this moment, that it remains with them.
Yeah, that's good, man. Let's talk for a second about, and our podcast today doesn't have to be as long as our last one, which was record-setting length of podcast.
Didn't feel like it though when we were talking.
It didn't. It was great. I appreciate that you did it with me. Um,
Yeah.
I wanna just hit on some things that I've watched happen nationally. I've watched on the news. I've watched on online. That are not empathy. And I think maybe it would be helpful for me to just kind of share some of those and
Sure.
explain why they're not empathy. We could talk about them together. One of the things I've watched happen this week is on the news. When I say watched, I've watched it on the news. In my own personal relationships, I've seen it online. One of the things that happens that is not empathy is I see people start to say, why are we talking about these specific injustices only right now? Why are we talking about injustice against black men, police brutality? Why are we talking about all the other injustices that are being done in the world? And I don't know how to communicate. That is so not empathy.
Yeah.
In a moment like this, that just like you wouldn't go up to somebody who has lost a loved one and say, "Hey, I understand that you've lost a loved one, but can I tell you?" Sorry about the phone ringing in the background, everybody. Back to my story with
Gotta
this.
love live.
This is we don't go back and re-record things when they get screwed up on this podcast. We just keep going. Um, it would be like saying to somebody, "Hey, I'm really sorry to hear you lost your wife. Can I tell you about the time I lost my dog?" Or even if it's a real serious thing that had happened to somebody, that's not always what you want in that moment. Have you felt some of that in the last couple of weeks, hearing those kind of comments?
Well, interestingly enough, we started talking about this a little bit last week, and there was another part of the conversation that I had with my friend who's on the SFPD.
Yeah, right.
You know, because there was a part of that conversation where he did say, "Well, what about me as a policeman?
Yeah, yeah,
You know, what about the things that I got to do as part of my job?
yeah,
Where's this feeling toward me?
yeah,
And while it was as a friend of his, it was a little difficult for me in that moment. I had to bring it back to what we were talking about.
Right. You know,
Yeah.
there is a time to talk about
Hmm.
policemen and how hard their job is,
Yep.
right? We should talk about that,
Yep.
and we should
Agreed.
show empathy toward that, and we should talk about the dangers of that. We should talk about the difficulties of judgment on that. We should talk about the stress that comes in a moment where you don't know what's going to. There's so much to talk about there, and maybe shame on us that we don't talk about it enough and show enough empathy toward that more frequently. But you can't take a moment like this and say, you know, let's switch the conversation and talk about this other thing and expect that empathy is shown in that. It's kind of like anybody who's ever been married or in any kind of serious relationship, when you are in an argument and you are trying to tell the person you're married to what is wrong and why you're hurt, and they go, oh, yeah? Well, what about the time
What
you did this?
exactly?
It breaks
Exactly.
down, man. Don't
Yeah.
do that, right? I think we see that a lot.
Well, and to me as a black man, there's another perspective on this. And that is this is a long-standing problem.
Yeah.
And what I mean by long-standing, I'm talking hundreds of years long-standing problem.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this is a moment for us to truly have the opportunity to move in a positive direction with this, to live up to the ideals that we say we believe in.
Yeah. 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 You're absolutely
Yeah.
right. Yeah. A second thing that I think does not help empathy, and I know some people are going to hear this and not be thrilled that I'm talking about it. When people feel like the thing to say in a moment right now is, well, all lives matter.
Mm,
I think that when people start to parse what's wrong with other people's statements, I don't like the statement Black Lives Matter. I'm going to say all lives matter. Blue lives matter. Well, of course, all lives matter. As believers, we believe that.
yeah.
This is not the moment in trying to show empathy to argue about whether or not all lives matter. You know what I'm saying on this, Michael? Have you felt that too?
Yeah. So, and I'll just be really transparent with you. That's a false argument.
Yeah.
It's a false argument. I don't know any folks
Yeah.
that would say all lives don't matter. I
Yeah.
don't know
Yeah.
anyone
Yeah.
that would say that.
Or
You
that
know,
blue lives don't matter. Who
or
would say
right,
that?
right, or the right. Um,
Yeah.
This can be a stumbling block for folks, I think,
Yeah.
and quite honestly, I think this can be a red herring.
Yep.
Because and by the way, I have seen over the past week numerous ways that people have been posting about trying to explain what this means.
Yeah. Yeah. We
And
talked
even
about it last week a
yeah,
little
and
bit.
you took a stab at it last week too. So you said add the word "to" on the end of
Well,
it, and maybe
I
that
said
gives you the context.
I said I'd read an article where somebody
Yeah,
said that there's an implied "to" on the end of
yeah,
that. That doesn't mean only Black Lives Matter, or right.
right,
Yeah.
right. And so you know, and I think it's easy to go down a couple paths with this that I think unfortunately open up debate, which is sometimes not positive. So one of the things that we have talked about and what I've been telling folks is educate yourself, please.
Yeah. Yeah.
Educate yourself. It's easy for me, Chris, to sit here and spout statistics to you, and I could
Yeah. Yeah.
that can substantiate my point of view on this.
Sure.
I would rather in this space you educate yourself. You know,
And
and I got a
and it's
chance.
easy to
Go
do
ahead.
that, right?
Yeah,
You
it's
can
it's
Google
really
these
easy.
things
Yeah,
at this point, and yeah,
it's really easy to do that.
I
To
think
understand when we say all lives can't matter until Black lives do, um,
yeah,
and where that is coming from.
it's important. I think one of the things you said a moment ago, and I want to be careful in this as we're talking about empathy to not escalate this argument. You
Yeah.
used the word a minute ago, right at the beginning of that part. Yeah, this is a false argument. You use that phrase, false argument. Exactly. It's an argument. And that's not what you do when you're showing empathy with somebody.
That's correct.
Is you don't argue with them. So even if for some reason, for some reason you have an issue with the phrase Black Lives Matter because you think it denies blue lives or all lives or whatever, empathy is not to take that time and go, well, we need to talk about that. I don't like that. Right? And I'll just say this is a lesson I've learned in the last 4 or 6 years or so. My tendency when I hear something in this kind of a moment, Michael, is to want to go, well, I don't know about that, all right? Let's talk about that phrasing. That's not empathy. Empathy is to come alongside someone and just say, tell me more about that. Tell me more about why you're feeling that or what that's all about,
Yeah, and and I mentioned, about opening up more of yourself and giving more of yourself. And what that implies is that, there's a great speaker out there. I won't get into it, but gives the symbolism of most of us wear armor.
Yeah.
And when we go into situations, we're armored up.
Yeah.
And I think most of us walk around with some degree of armor on.
Yeah.
In this space of empathy, we're a chance to take the armor off.
Yeah.
Disarm ourselves. Be open.
Yeah.
Give up your right to be right.
Yeah. Yeah.
and be open.
Yeah, that's part of what empathy is, right? It's taking off that armor. I love that analogy. That's good. That's a great metaphor for this. One other thing that I hear a lot, and I don't mean a lot. I don't want to imply that this is 90% of what I'm hearing. This is a small little fraction, but I hear people in moments like this go, well, I understand that we're talking about what happened to George Floyd, but what about all the looting? What about all the rioting? You and I talked last week before we recorded. We didn't have a long conversation, but we had said, let's not talk about looting on this podcast today because that's not what this is about. And it changes and shifts the conversation to being about something else. And Michael, you're not looting. So if I'm your friend and we're sitting down and I want to understand your experience and what's going on with you, for me to say to you, okay, well, I appreciate the fears you have, the injustice that's been done, the way you felt marginalized in society at times. But what about all those other people who are doing what you're not doing? What does that do to you in a moment like that?
Yeah. Let's talk about looting a little bit.
Okay.
Because last week we said we wanted to avoid the conversation because we really wanted to key in on allyship.
Right. Allyship, yeah.
So, for folks that may have said, well, what about that? Why don't you guys talk about that?
Yeah.
We could have, we probably just didn't want you to have to sit through a 2-hour-long podcast, which we would have been happy to do.
Well, and my answer to that has been because the goal. Michael's not looting. I'm not. I'm not there to. We're here to talk about what his experience has been. So, sorry. Go ahead.
And that's okay. So, what I want to draw, attention to is, yes, there was looting at the beginning of the protests. Do you hear about it today? Not really. And I think because folks who are organizing the protests are one saying, listen, we want to make sure that we keep the focus on the message like you and I did last week. And you might have noticed that in some areas, business owners were putting up signs that says, I'm a POC. I'm a woman-owned business. I'm a family-owned business. Empathy.
Yeah. There you go.
Right?
There you go.
Driving empathy from a crowd of folks, and because this message is so strong right now. Early on, you could have been someone in there that may have cared less about the message and more about doing other things that are not as constructive. Yeah. But for this thing to last 2+ weeks, you got to be about the message.
Yeah.
Well,
and that's where you say it's a red herring when we talk about any of these three things I've mentioned, from looting, rioting, to injustice done to me, to all lives matter. It's a red herring. It's changing the subject. It's hey, rather than talking about this thing that's happened to George Floyd and marginalization of people of color and brutality. We're going to talk about these other things instead. And if I can change the subject, we're not going to go back to that other thing. And I don't know that people are intentionally, I don't know that, I'm sure some people are intentionally trying to change the subject, but I think most people are not. They just don't realize that empathy doesn't call for that. It doesn't allow for that. It says, I want to acknowledge it. Let's just hit those again. I want to acknowledge your pain. I want to listen to what's going on with you. Can I add in that gratitude for you sharing with us what's going on with you? That's part of empathy too. Like, thank you for talking about this, making yourself vulnerable enough with me that you would open up. If we could add another one to this list of 3, that might be a fourth. And gratitude never says, well, thank you for bringing it up, but what about looting, right?
Yeah.
And then finally, this third one or fourth one, if we had gratitude, is what it means to speak up and to take action. I think really, really important to be supportive. Here, if I'm going to support you in this, the way that I would support somebody who is in a health situation, showing empathy, I might support them by saying, "Can I do your laundry for you? Can I drive you to the doctor? Can I bring you food?" How do I support Michael Mosby right now in this? And my support is probably less, "Let me bring you dinner tonight. You're going to still go get dinner," I think. But what you're saying is speak up.
Speak up.
Yeah.
Speak up. Now, and be aware that speak up is not your first action. It's after you've done what you've talked about.
Yeah.
Active listening, acknowledging, being all these things that we talked about being empathetic.
Yeah.
And getting a better understanding and a better connection, then acting. and using your voice.
So good, man. You know, I had a really smart professor in seminary say, and we should probably wrap up. I had somebody say, the time to answer the question, why does God allow bad things to happen, is not when someone is in the middle of the bad thing happening. It is a theological question that is really heady, and there's 20 answers to it through Scripture and a lot of philosophy. And when someone's in the middle of that pain, they may cry out that question, but what they really need is you to just come alongside them and let them know God is with them in that moment. I feel like there's some parallels in this. All these other things that people might feel a need to want to talk about or debate or argue over or think through. Yeah. The time to think them through is not in the middle of someone else's painful moment.
Yeah.
There can be a time for that another time. But in this time, the time is to come alongside, to listen, to acknowledge pain, to show gratitude, to be supportive. So, Michael, thanks for coming on, man. You're a great podcast guest. I don't know if you're willing, but we don't always have to talk about this. I'd love to have you on to talk about anything.
I'd be happy to.
All right. Thanks. I'll catch you later.
You got it. Take care.
Bye-bye.